Good evening, welcome back to Marty's Tying Bench. I'm putting together kits for this week's Vice Squad, and I've got a favorite PMD nymph. It's a beadhead PMD that kind of started simple, and I've added a few things to it, and I got something that works quite well, and I like it. I don't really have a fancy name for it. I just call it a PMD Deep PMD. I guess you could call it an emerger because it features a color change between the abdomen and the thorax, which is PMDs are notorious for emerging subsurface. So you can bounce this one along the bottom, and you'll probably pick up a few fish that think it's a little yellow Sally nymph as well. Tied in a size 16 and 18, and the bead on the size 16 is 3/32. The thread, any light color thread will do. This one is a Danville's 70 denier, kind of a golden olive. The body material, or excuse me, the wing and the tail are Antron yarn, and the color is known as PMD Shuck. Now, the volume of it is too much for the shuck and the legs, so I usually divide it in half, and you can do that with a needle or a bodkin, or I just run my whip finisher through it until I get it divided about in half, and then that's going to be a better volume. Finish getting that separated. Okay, I'm going to kind of twist it to keep it together. And I'm going to tie a good 3/4 of an inch out in front of the bead, because I'm going to fold that back as legs, and I want something to handle when I separate them out to the sides. Now I'm going to tie this right up to the bead, and put a few extra wraps here. I mean, those beads can slide back over your fly, so you need to have enough bulk to keep it from doing that, and I like to do that with thread, which will stop the small part of the bead, you know, the countersunk bead. I'm going to run this all the way back to the bend of the hook, so that this shuck is going to be pointing somewhat down, and cut it, you know, about half the length of the hook, and I'll kind of tease it out. Once it gets wet and dries out and gets chewed on a little bit, it'll be fluffy like you want it. They're not tails, it's a trailing shuck, but if you hear me say tail, I'm talking about that shuck. Now, for a rib, I've got your basic UTC copper wire. The size on this one is a small, and I'm just going to tie that along the side of the shank, not worry too much if it twists a little bit. But I'm only going to go to the middle of the hook. The abdomen is going to take up the back half, and the thorax will take up the front half. Dubbing, any kind of an olive brown, olive tan. The copper wire is going to give it its character, so there's a range of dubbings you can use underneath. But I do suggest you use a superfine or a real fine dubbing, because you kind of want this nymph to be slick. Now with a real thin dubbing noodle, I can start in the middle and go back, and then as I come forward, I will slow down my turns until I got just a bit of a taper. Come forward with the ribs, and I'm going to put the ribs pretty close together. So I got like 7 turns in just that half of a hook shank. Now you see that all those ribs kind of changes the texture and the color of that abdomen. That's why the color of the dubbing underneath is less critical, I think. We're going to put a little bit of flash on it. So I've got a spool of Opal tinsel. This one's a medium. You can just use just about anything if you have the smaller lateral scale or Flashaboo or something. And I'll tie that on the top of the hook. And I want it to see how that's hinging right in the middle of the hook space. Let's see if I can get that stay out of the way. Now I'm going to switch to the color of the emerging dun. Any kind of yellow will do. This one is Superfine light Cahill. They put out a color called PMD, which is a little duller. Any of these will work, just so it's more distinctly yellow than the abdomen. Again, I'm going to keep my dubbing noodle thin so that I can use it to shape a little bit. And I'm going to come right up behind the bead and make sure I get that bead squared up. Now I want the abdomen to be at least as big around as the bead, or close to it. So I'm going to add a little bit of dubbing here. Okay. Now I'm going to get my thread in front and make sure my bead is squared. Make sure there's no burrs on the bead that are going to break your thread, cut your thread. I'm going to reach up here and divide this Antron again in half and just physically pull it down to the sides. Let me reposition this hook a little bit so you can see the top better. And I'll fold that flash over. Now you need to give that flash a little bit of slack so that when that thread goes down, if it pulls a little bit of flash with it, it won't cut that mylar. Alright, now I'll just sweep everything back. And I truly think a little bit of head cement's never a bad idea when you're tying a whip finish behind a bead rather than against the bare hook. So I'm just going to get a little bit of lacquer on the thread. There we go. Looks like that strip of flash is fairly well centered. Now I'm going to cut these legs so that they're about halfway down the abdomen. Poke them a few times to get them to spread out. There you go. Got a beadhead deep PMD nymph. Fish this one all summer long. It's a good pattern.